Hello, everyone. We are waiting to start our horse talk. We've got people starting to come in now. But we're here today with Steve Martens, who is someone that I've had the honor of crossing paths with as we've been fighting for the wild horses of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And he has his own area of expertise and knowledge that he's been sharing with us over the last couple of years. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about who he is and what he's done. And the big topic today is the Historic Preservation Act and how that applies to our wild horse advocacy. So thank you, Steve, and welcome to our horse talk today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to do this. I've been looking forward to trying to discuss the advocacy that North Dakotans are doing. I think with remarkable success for the horse herds, and I've been kind of involved peripherally with a lot of these issues. Um, my I wish I could figure out how to get a bigger. Am I speaking loudly enough? There's not a lot of background noise or?
Nope, you're fine.
Okay, good. Um, I it, it strikes me as amazing how the advocacy has really taken hold in North Dakota, and how it's reached, not only the public, the citizens of North Dakota, but our public officials and so forth. And Chris, I'm always inspired by uh, the information that you send out. It's so gratifying to see an evocative picture of the horses as sort of part of how you introduce this conversation. It reminds us of what the real, what the importance of what we're trying to accomplish is all about. So, my background with this kind of came from the standpoint of I'm always anxious to get my point of view on the public record the best I can. That's the only way. As a private citizen, that's the only way that I can have my say about these issues. And so I wrote 2 or 3 responses to the Park Service during their comment period, both the first comment period and the second comment period. And I think they went on to like 10 or 15 pages or something like that. And you never really know. There's never any feedback or response. You never know. They did acknowledge the receipt of the information, but whether it motivated anybody to do anything or not, I have no idea. So I keep looking for ways that I can get my point of view onto the public record. And one of the ways that I have some previous experience with is this whole National Register or Historic Preservation Act process. And I thought there might be some people who would be interested in knowing where that all came about, or how that process came about. It's uh, everyone has to make their own judgment about whether this process of the National Register is helpful to what you're all trying to do. And I commend the fact that you're fighting this battle on a lot of different fronts. I guess you're communicating with the state legislators, you're communicating with the governor's office, with the senatorial delegation, and most of all, I think you're encouraging people to communicate amongst themselves. And so, one more uh, pathway for communications, I guess, is this communication that I've hoped to open up with the State Historical Society. I have been involved with the State Historical Society for basically since I came to North Dakota. I came here in 1966, and that was the same year that the U.S. Historic Preservation Act was established. It was a federal law that was introduced under the Johnson administration and signed into law, kind of making the point that all Americans are invested in preserving their heritage. The law was enacted to encourage cooperation between federal agencies and the states for the purpose of preserving cultural heritage. And it was the first really unified commitment of the United States to the idea of preserving heritage. And with now what would that be, about 55 years of experience with it, it has stood the test of time. I guess it's a really I have found it to be a really helpful framework just for learning and discovery, if nothing else. But it's also intended to be a vehicle for making things happen. And there are a lot of incentives and requirements for agencies to communicate. One of the things that it establishes is that federal agencies are required by this law to consult and cooperate with state agencies that are charged with the responsibility of preserving resources within the state. And so it's kind of an unusual hybrid here. It's a combination of a federal policy that mandates states to establish a historic preservation office and delegate the responsibility of a qualified person under state law to moderate this process, to to answer the questions, to facilitate this cooperation and consultation that has to happen between the agencies and the state. And every state does this process a little differently. Every state law establishes what the authority of the state historic preservation officer is in that state. But fundamentally, the one charge that sort of runs true is that they're charged with an obligation to protect the historic resources of the state. And so from my experience, I kind of see that as an open door to make an argument for why one of the most valuable, if not maybe the most important historic resource in the state of North Dakota is the Missouri Badlands landscape, and that includes all the features that are in it, and that's the horses. So, how does a person go about making that argument? And I've now been sort of working on that for about the past 3.5 years. I came to North Dakota in 1966 as a high school kid. My folks brought me here to go to my last year of high school at White Shield School on the MHA reservation lands, and I was just fascinated when I saw the first day. I saw all the little elementary school kids running to the windows at the library, and there were a bunch of free range Indian ponies wandering onto the playground there. And it was obviously this was something that inspired them spiritually, and things like that kind of make me want to continue to learn more and more about that, as I've now spent about 55 years of looking at this kind of stuff. So I the State Historic Preservation Officer has the legal authority and the responsibility for preserving and protecting significant properties. So, with that important word significant in there, I keep looking for a way to, you know, make sure that this declaration that the property is significant. And I think Bill Peterson's first response letter to the Park Service, when he received their letter that they were conjuring up a management plan, and they sent it in draft form at that time as an attachment to the letter, and said, we don't see any problem with anything that we're proposing to do here. And his very brief one-page letter of response said, well, you really haven't given anybody enough information to evaluate whether there are negative impacts from this plan that you're putting out. He says, we can say one thing, and that is that the park landscape is an important, significant historic resource in the state of North Dakota. And in consideration of his duties to state law and to the people of North Dakota, it has to be treated as a significant resource, and that means doing all they can do to protect it. And I think maybe this second follow-up letter that may be going out today reinforces that point, that's how they're approaching it, is that anytime a federal agency is undertaking something that may impact a significant property, SHPO has to be notified and make a determination of any possible negative impacts. And so we haven't completed that process yet. There's still evaluation that's going on, but the state is on record as saying this is significant. And that word significant, kind of it in the jargon of the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, that charged the National Park Service with writing guidelines for how people make persuasive arguments for the significance of heritage resources. And it took them about 8 years of consultation. So where they had, a panel of really wise experts in this process. And so they wrote the rules that, that there are 4 criteria that would demonstrate significance of a historic property. And so saying something is significant isn't just one person's opinion, or it's not a matter of whether we like it or whether it excites us. The criteria sort of stipulate that it either has to be an important historic feature or resource, important in terms of, or significant in terms of patterns of events, of a singular event or patterns of historical events. So that's the first criterion, I think, is exactly the one that applies to several aspects of this landscape. And I've tried to argue now on the basis of that first criterion that this landscape is clearly significant in the patterns of events of how the park was designed and planned, how it was enacted into park status, and also the historical events associated with the period of time before it became a park. That was its original purpose. And along the way, the State Historic Preservation Office commissioned me in 2010 to do a statewide context of the federal relief construction projects from the Great Depression era, and that put me in contact with a lot of people that know the early history of the Badlands and the history of the park, and that was sort of the basis of how I went about trying to make this argument for its obvious significance to me. There's another aspect, another criterion for significance. The second two really just apply to an important person, and that becomes really messy to argue, because I have learned from having tried to make that argument several times that just the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was associated with the North Dakota landscape is not, it's not going to be an argument well received. And there have been some changes along the way. When this was originally designed as a regional demonstration park, that was its real purpose, to capture the characteristics of the landscape from Roosevelt's time out there. So the third criterion, I guess, has to do with architectural stuff, and that's my specialty, but it doesn't really apply here, all the architectural substantiations. But the fourth one, criterion D, is another really kind of an interesting one, and it has to do with treating a historic resource in terms of its potential to yield discovery or to add to our future knowledge about something. And as I've read more about this, I think that an argument could be made for the property to be for the park to be significant, both for the patterns of events it embodies and also for the potential for discovery. So that was kind of my first page of notes. I started out preparing for this. I ended up with about 10, like any academic, 10 pages of notes that I made to myself. And I thought, there isn't anybody out there in the world that could possibly want to know all this kind of stuff. I used to force college students to sit through, 2-day seminars about exactly this topic, about where this National Register business came from and so forth. But I think what most people that may be tuning in today really want to know at the moment is, how does it relate to the advocacy that is being done at the present time. So I kind of pared it down to just 3 pages of much shorter notes, and wanted to try to get through each one of them in about 15 minutes. I'm doing not too badly here on my first page of notes. So if you feel the need to interrupt me anywhere along the way, I'll try to listen. I'll draw a breath every now and then and chance if I've explained that. But the other thing, I know you're set up, Chris, to receive text message comments, or I think you are, from people out there. And if you'll keep those and share them with me somewhere along the way at the end, or display them for me, or whatever, I'll sure try to answer any questions. And I want to make this point once right now, and then I'll reemphasize it at the end of the process. I'm always welcome to conversation with people about this kind of stuff. My email address is kind of complicated. It's kind of hard. If you've got a pen in hand to write it down, it's Martens Frozen Music, and my last name is spelled Martens, and then the letters Frozen Music all run together as one address. And my Gmail account is at gmail.com. And that's usually the most reliable way to get information to me. And if you want to ask any questions of me, maybe start there first. Give me a chance to respond. I always have my cell phone with me, but I got a phone call yesterday from an old friend, Patrick Springer, who had some questions about this whole process, and I was trying to do it in the car on my cell phone and not run over anybody in the process. And I should probably avoid that. I should probably try to, maybe we could set up another time for a phone conversation, or I'll try to answer any questions that people may have individually. But that's a good point of contact for me anyway. So I took it onto myself uh, to write several draft significance statements. That was my fourth attempt to try to get my opinion on the record about this kind of stuff. I've been talking with Bill Peterson, the State Historic Preservation Officer, uh, for about 3 years now about why I think the horses are important. And my latest round of communications with him and his staff has been that, here would be one way that someone might make the argument for the significance of these properties, for the park's significance, and for the significance as of the horse herds as an important feature within it. And it gets to be kind of a long, drawn out argument. You can sort of imagine this academic side of all this kind of stuff. I've tried to invoke all the things that I've discovered and read and found, all the things that are glaring at me on my computer desktop right now, the files of all the research, Castle McLaughlin's amazing research that sort of sparked an appreciation for the heritage significance of those horses. And my conversations with Frank Kuntz, hearing about this resource from people who have lived more intimately with it than I have gets me to asking questions. And then from there, you can go to the incredible body of information that's on the public record, studies that have been done and research that has been published in various places. And we live in an age now where all that research is sort of accessible to us on the internet. And so I've accumulated, I think I've got about 400 files of things that people have published or declared about the significance of the horses in this landscape. And they approach it from a lot of different directions. They approach it from the standpoint of uh, what the park system, national parks as a public institution, they approach it from the standpoint of the genetic viability of these horses and why that's something that has utility and meaning to the people of North Dakota. So for me, the real payback on this up to this point has all been the discovery that I've made by learning how much information there is out there that is accessible to the staff at the State Historic Preservation Office, and it's accessible to the National Park Service. It's just a matter of what can a person do to get them to take a look. And so I've shared a draft of my argument. My mom tried to raise me to never talk back and never argue, and I, sort of made that my mission in life. I see this as an argument that has to be made with people that would perhaps just as soon not hear it, and getting my argument on the record any way that I possibly can. So I was kind of tapping the door of the State Historic Preservation Office and telling my friends out there that I've worked with for years that here's one rationale for significance that somebody ought to, if the Park Service ever declares that it can't be treated as a significant historic resource, this is why I think it should. And then I attach to that my bibliography that I've compiled, and it's a work in progress. I keep adding new things that I discover, but I've tried to read those 400 documents that are out there on the public record and kind of factor that into my discovery. So the research and writing, it was a basis for a rationale that now has been provided to the State Historic Preservation Office, and I keep asking them to, factor this into your responses to the Park Service. And I've always been treated really well. They're always receptive to information from the public that comes in there. And Bill Peterson mentioned that to me in my most recent phone conversation. He says, please be mindful that, we are here to serve the people of North Dakota, and my door and my phone is open to them. And we're always happy to discuss, these issues and points of view. What I'm foisting on them is a little more cumbersome than that. I'm giving them a 20-page document or something that says, here are all the resources that support the argument that I'm making. But I have to get it all on the record. And it came up again yesterday in the conversation with Patrick Springer. Another way of getting information on the public record is the excellent coverage that the published media has been doing of getting this information in front of the citizens of North Dakota and presenting it to them in such a way that I can't imagine that people would not care about this. And I guess all the proof is out there that people do care about this. All the editorial letters that have been written back to newspapers all across the country and the opinions that are out there, they really reflect why people regard this as significant. So I'm trying to use this National Register process as a way of kind of tying together some of that advocacy that I keep hearing. Um,
Steve, can I ask you a question just for a minute
sure
there
thing.
while you were talking about it?
Mhm.
Because it's one thing as advocates that we try to really drive home to people that letters to the editor do matter for a lot of different reasons. I mean, one, we know that that's how we got the attention of our state legislators, but you're saying, I think too, that it does matter when you're trying to create a record of support for historical value also.
I don't have access to the National Park Service. I can't make them listen to any of my comments that I submitted to them. But I do have access to the State Historic Preservation, and I've always found them, because of their duty under the law to the citizens of North Dakota and to the state of North Dakota, which now having a unified support for this position that chasing wild horses is uh, kind of and has captured, having access to them, we're all on the same play page. Now everyone is arguing this from the same point of view. And so I think that makes the State Historic Preservation Office all the more receptive to these. And they are my vehicle for access to the National Park Service. There are going to be a whole series of long conversations and lengthy letters that are written back and forth. And I've never been really satisfied that public agencies are willing to take the time to to cite all this tedious literature that is important from my point of view, that really makes the argument. And so I keep looking for ways to remind people of that and get that onto the public record. And I'll send another revised copy later this afternoon, both to Bill Peterson at the State Historic Preservation Office and to Patrick Springer, and say, these are the things that I think the public needs to know and needs to think about. And for that reason, I hope that as much of that as possible finds its way both to our larger audience, to the people of North Dakota, but also to the National Park Service. And maybe you can probably imagine that there's also what a sub theme to all this. The only thing that the National Park Service can really be compelled to do is to follow policies and procedures. And if they're tuning out public comment, or if their further management plans don't uh, acknowledge that public comment, then they haven't followed the procedures, and that then becomes maybe for the future. I made a note to myself here to ask you somewhere along the way. It'll be sort of my at the end of this. I wonder if the law firm that you've been consulting with might regard the failure of the Park Service to follow their policies and procedures might be the best cause for a future appeal if there's an unresponsive management plan that comes forward. And so I do know that the State Historic Preservation Office is not prepared to accept an unresponsive management plan. Their duty is, as Judge Judy always says, sort of defined by the four corners of this piece of paper. Their duty is to protect the resources on behalf of the people of North Dakota. And so any response that they give to a declaration that there is no negative impact of eliminating the horse herds, well, how can anybody make that argument uh, in a way that reflects the input and process that's happened up till now? So
Yep.
okay, well, is that okay? Is that
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
sure thing? um, the things I've been sending have been kind of piecemeal, and I've sent you 2 or 3 drafts of these things, and I should probably send you another one again today too. I keep adding resources to my bibliography, and I'm afraid you may probably have accumulated 3 or 4 of my draft significant statements on your desktop, but I think I'm kind of done writing and talking about it for at least for a little while after today. And if I send you another one, if you want to add it to your resource library, a lot of the documents that I've consulted are in the Wild Horses resource library. And I know Patrick mentioned that he found his way to several of those that have informed my thinking about this. So you're always welcome to put. So there's three pathways that I've tried to open to get my point of view out in front of people. Anybody that is willing to take the time to listen to me, I should be watching to see how many people have clicked off from listening to me today. May come a point where hearing what I have to say or fast forwarding through it on a YouTube saved video will get you where you need to be. But I've learned that, to make a compelling argument for the significance of a historic resource takes about 100 pages of well-supported narrative and some well-cited scholarly citations, so that it's not just one person's opinion, but here's what the academic or scholarly study of the horses in this landscape tell us. Castle McLaughlin's first writing about this is a perfect example of that. That can be cited and has been cited in every response to the idea that these may be significant. Um, Let me tell you a little bit about the three arguments that I've made, and let's see. That's going to take me about another 15 minutes. The criterion that this is a significant designed landscape. The National Park Service has a guideline that says, how do you evaluate the significance of a designed historic landscape? And so that sort of lays down the rules of the argument that you have to make. Um, uh, I have learned over time that that the park itself emerged in the 1930s and 40s as a process of collaboration between the National Park Service, the WPA, the CCC, and particularly the State Historical Society of North Dakota's superintendent at the time, Russell Reed. And there's an excellent record of the deliberations that they went through, the master plans that they tested, and these are available both at the State Historical Society of North Dakota and available at the National Park Service. Now, whether the National Park Service chooses to consult those in formulating their opinions, I will take it as an article of faith that they are dutiful in knowing that this information is there, and it has some implications about the judgments that were made about acknowledging the horses in the park. I met someone who was a lifelong rancher from the Little Missouri Badlands, the area that's within the park right now, Marjorie Grattan, who passed away at age 94, and shared all of her recollections of the process of the Park Service coming to North Dakota and working with the State Historical Society. She was a good friend of Russell Reed, and she watched this all take place. And her husband was a landscape architect who was employed by the National Park Service to come to North Dakota and learn from the people in those landscapes. And he did a masterful job. And so in a sense, this is a sacred duty for me to reflect the things that I've learned from Marjorie Grattan and the things that I've learned from people like Frank Kuntz about the history of the horses being in that landscape. And it's always gratifying to see, their experiences are documented in the footnotes and the bibliographies appended to Castle McLaughlin's study and all the others that have been done. So, these things are an important part of the record. Basically, the idea that a landscape can be designed in a way that serves a purpose of telling an aspect of our history, I think that's an easy argument to make here, and one that I have not seen acknowledged anywhere in it. Now, something has happened along the way from the time that this property went into the control of the National Park Service as a national park, and today, in 1976, they went through a very lengthy, complicated process of redefining the mission of the National Park Service. Imagine that. And they called it Mission 66, and it was basically dealing with the fact that there had been a movement away from considering historic resources as culturally significant and treating them instead as what I'll call it scenographic, as a reflection of a natural landscape setting. And so all of the park services kind of went in the one direction with this after 1966. I've always had a problem with modernism in architecture because modernism was about the business of sort of saying that, well, everything that was known before today in 1976, everything that was known before today doesn't matter anymore. We're in a new place, and the vision of the future is that we're going to define what modernism tells us that these landscapes are going to be about. I don't think that Mission 66 document uh, fairly reflects all the differences in national parks all over the country. So I keep trying to find ways to bring the attention of the Park Service back to this fact that as a designed historic landscape, it has meaning in terms of the relationship of that place to North Dakota. The fact that this was a partnership, a collaborative partnership between the State Historical Society and the Park Service to create the park in the first place. And then the second one, I guess, that I think is really compelling is if we say that the period of significance for this park is the period from 1700 to 1900, that takes in its cultural significance to two different, two or three different uh, Native American communities. Excuse me, apologize for that. Um, the There's been some amazing research that's been done. A professor from Texas A&M University named Hamalainen, a Finlander, who has studied the spread of horses across the Great Plains, and talks about the difference of the way the uh, Lakota people treated the horses and the way the MHA Nation treated the horses. And we might also then say the Crow and the Blackfeet treated them in a different way. And so the way they found their ways into those cultures is an important thing that's embodied by the fact that they all kept horses in the Little Missouri Badlands. That was a special place. That was a place where they determined how the horses would be useful to them, and where they manipulated the horse populations through natural breeding processes and through adaptation to that landscape. And so, to the extent that that those horses are unique and distinctive in the landscape, I think we need to remind the Park Service of their importance to those two cultures. And that's why it's really important to me that both the Standing Rock Lakota and the MHA Tribal Council are on record as having said we regard these as culturally significant to us. The Park Service, it seems to me, has no choice in respecting and considering that cultural importance. And then I have added to that, I think, what Theodore Roosevelt and the Marquis de Moray and the Weedekoppers and all the people who used that landscape for grazing cattle and for ranching purposes in the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s. That's just a part of that same cultural tradition. It's a part. It's the cultural tradition of using the landscape for constructed human activities. I wrote myself a note in the margin here that said, uh, you know, this business of historical events, of saying that the patterns of historical events are what make these things significant. That's a cultural phenomenon. That's not a natural phenomenon. It's not about nature or preserving nature and so forth. The whole point of that park being there is its reflection of the way three distinct cultures have used it over the course of several hundred years. And then, belatedly, I think this was one that some people might find a little peculiar, but I kept getting feedback on the idea that, the idea that the Nakota horses are special or something special about them, or that it may not be any genetic remnant of DNA in those horses anymore that shows that they were originally connected with Sitting Bull's surrender tribe, or his tribe surrender, and this long pattern that the U.S. government has had, particularly the U.S. Army, of forcing the surrender of horses from people that have cultivated these herds over time. And so I felt the need to address that I think there is still a lot that has not been learned from the studies that have been done about the adaptation of those horses to this landscape. I think those horse herds and your photographs and the stories that you tell about your encounters there and the things I hear back from other people uh, clearly there is something special about the adaptation that they have made to that landscape. And I tend to, sort of distill that down to saying it's their birthright. They've got a right to be there because they've always been there. They were there before we were there. And so I think treating them, the significance is not in individual horses, it's in the adaptation of that herd. That herd has, that is the historic resource that's in that place, and that's why that it has to be preserved in whole. They can't eliminate half of it, or say that we're going to cull out the horses that don't have the right DNA and so forth. I think that kind of willful intrusion of managers is not at all consistent with this idea that what they're preserving is the heritage of that resource. So that was my say that I wanted to have, and I'm still not losing ground too badly here in time. I those are my arguments that I tried to make in the significant statement. Now, I'll make a little transition here, and then if you want to jump in and redirect me along the way, I've listened carefully to the points that I've heard back from Bill Peterson. Asked this. Historic preservation archaeologist in their division at the State Historical Society to investigate these issues and sort of contribute some of the narrative to this response letter that I think is going out today. And Bill emphasized to me, he says he would really appreciate if the letter is in the hands of the Park Service before the public starts inquiring about it. And so he said that a timely response, middle of next week would be the right time for this information to be disclosed. And if anyone wants to email him or contact him, or I suggested this to Pat Springer as well, the information will be public at that point in time, and Bill will be more than happy to share it. But I guess it's a professional courtesy, and it's also really the right way to do this, is to make sure that the people to whom the communication has been directed have received it before other people.
Can I stop you for a minute so that we can,
Sure thing.
just so that people, to help people understand? So the Historic Preservation Act says when a federal agency undertakes something like what Theodore Roosevelt National Park is, that there has to be a Section 106 review process, correct? And
Correct.
that's in the hands of the State Historic Preservation Office, which I know that we've talked about before too, and I don't know if you mentioned it here. When the State Historic Preservation Officer was assigned or appointed by the governor, the Park Service had to also be in agreement of that, correct?
That he has to meet their requirements. They aren't consulted in his appointment, but that person, I guess, the head of the State Historical Society, is the person that the state delegates the responsibility for SHPO, and that person does meet the qualifications that are required by the National Park Service.
So we do know, because there was that secret document the park had, that they were very, they seemed to think that this was going to be an easy win for them. They weren't really concerned about the Section 106 review process. But so first of all, when they sent their information to the State Historic Preservation Office, after a short amount of time, what you're saying is Bill Peterson, our State Historic Preservation Officer, said to the park, we understand that you're undertaking this process, but you have not given our office enough information to back your argument that these horses are not culturally and historically significant.
Precisely. Essentially, the Park Service itself triggered the 106 review process
Right.
by acknowledging that they were doing an undertaking. What a perfect choice of words there, right? But their management plan was an undertaking, and any federal agency engaged in an undertaking has to go through the 106 review process and has to consult and cooperate with the State Historic Preservation Officer.
So, to your knowledge, then, the park cannot complete this process, this management process, until the Section 106 review process is signed off on, correct?
Uh, Let me see. Let me try to be as accurate and specific as I can about that. They can submit their management plan, and the outcome from the state historic preservation officer would be to say that we disagree with this. We don't agree with this management plan. We don't agree that there's no negative impact, and so we do not concur in the decision to implement this management plan.
I guess,
And
so my question is, we won't see a final EA from the park until this process is completed, correct?
right,
Okay, so when the park is saying, or we've heard like rumors of April, it doesn't seem doable at the moment. Because we know, and I know our organization, I reached out to Bill Peterson, and you said you would talk to him also this week. They haven't, so they actually told the park, we need more information from you. So the park is now charged with updating their report to the State Historic Preservation Office, trying to make their argument. And the park has not done that yet. And I know that because Bill Peterson emailed me this morning.
right,
So you're saying now, what you're talking about here, and why I wanted to stop you, is that now that Bill Peterson hasn't heard from the park in a significant amount of time, he's essentially going, if I'm understanding right, going to send a letter to the park and say, hey, remember, we have this going on and our office is reviewing this. We're still waiting for your documentation, correct?
correct,
Okay.
correct. Yeah. And he sees maybe the end result of what the Park Service is doing as a full environmental impact statement with an attached, they call it FONSI, a finding of no negative significant impacts on the
Right.
resource.
Right.
And and that those documents take several years to prepare. But we keep hearing from the Park Service that they're working on completing some kind of documentation that they may submit. Maybe it's a revised draft, but in April is what I've always heard, and I don't even know where I may have heard that from, but we keep getting that feedback, and so that's why the State Historic Preservation Office thought it was timely to let them know that yes, the meter is running on this. I mean, we're still waiting.
Well, and we do know, while the park usually has a no comment response to the press, they did, I believe it was one of the articles that came out recently. The response was that the park didn't have a comment, but Angie Richmond did state that they were in the process of becoming compliant with the Section 106 review process, which also reiterates that there's a big importance here in this fight to save these horses. This is a significant piece of our fight.
I'm glad you highlighted that, and I'm glad that you heard it the same way that I did when that comment, appeared. That that there were several things in the notes that the Park Service released to the public from their public comment episode that, to me, suggested that they are considering that information. They didn't, they tabulated it. They looked for they counted the number of novel comments and so forth, and but they're doing more than that. They are considering that information, and I think that's a reasonable expectation. I mean, it's not like we shouldn't be really happy that they're doing their job. It's they're obligated to do that. So yes, thanks for highlighting that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bill Peterson, as the SHPO, as a representative of the state of North Dakota, never wants to reveal anything that might tempt the Park Service to become unresponsive. And so he's always kind of looking for ways that he can cultivate this idea. There is one other recourse if his determination. We're talking hypothetical here now, but if his determination at the end of this process is that what is being proposed does not meet state law as far as protecting the natural resource, there is another level of review that agencies sometimes go to, and it's called the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. And these are a national panel of experts in all aspects of history that can be convened to consider a judgment that is entered by the state historic preservation officer. And so we can be confident that he's going to write this from the perspective of the state of North Dakota. But there may be other opinions that come along later that say, okay, we've heard the opinions of North Dakota, and we do not acquiesce to position is taken by the state. Does that muddy things any, or um,
No, no, that's good. Thank you.
sure. Um, the in drafting this correspondence that becomes ripe this week, the staff there has found a number of interesting resources in their files that go back and kind of reconstruct how the park was implemented, and in particular, a letter from Governor Guy that talked about the transfer of control of that resource, a property that had been owned by the state of North Dakota, to the federal government. And it's Bill characterized this in his conversations with me as let's see, what was his? He had a good word for it. I hope it'll be worth waiting for here. I think I had spliced it into my notes. Well, I'll have to come back to it here again in a little bit. Essentially there were uh, understandings that were included in that transfer of ownership that said this resource is to be protected for the people of North Dakota. So again, it puts the Park Service on. They accepted that. That was their memorandum of understanding with the state of North Dakota. That in accepting control of this for the national park system, they were acceding to the expectation that would be maintained for the benefit of the heritage of the people of North Dakota. And I think, it's amazing to me how those things that, disappear. Donor intent was the word that he used. And I think that's a principle that at some point in time may make sense to your attorneys, that, there's an acknowledgement of donor intent in the correspondence and the communication between the governor of the state and the National Park Service, and the federal government. Okay, that's probably as much as anybody ever would want to know about what I think about significance and the National Register process. I continue to believe that with the enormous body of sound scholarly evidence that's on the public record that supports the position that North Dakotans are taking, uh, and precious little that's anywhere out there that I've seen that supports the conclusion of the Park Service that they could go ahead and eliminate this herd with no negative impact, that this is an avenue worth pursuing. That the National Register process and the 106 review process are something that we all benefit from understanding, and we ought to take every opportunity to have input into whenever that's given to us. And again, the news media has done such a magnificent job of keeping the citizens informed of that, and I trust that we can keep that path of communication going with really not only Patrick Springer but all the media that have given attention and coverage to this. It's been my wife and I have a little escape place in Lakota that we go to from time to time, and it was fun to see the Lakota American newspaper ran the article talking about this. I mean, the word is reaching, all parts of North Dakota, and there is a surprise, and the whole nation really. There is a surprising, level of not only interest, but I would say genuine understanding that comes from people reading these well written journalistic articles. Um, I'll go back to, let's see. The National Park Service originally wrote the guidelines for cultural heritage significance. And in a sense, they kind of, how's that expression go? Uh, they made their plate and now they have to live with it. They have to eat from it. They wrote the guidelines. And so I think, again, holding them to that standard of making sure that they recognize their duty for cultural history in addition to resource management. And I think, they're great for, rewriting definitions when it serves their purposes. I still think the, absurdity of characterizing the horses as livestock because that was a more convenient, I every opportunity I get, I say, you got to roll that back. That's not the fact of the matter here. Everything that defines what these horses are about. So, um, uh, the Mission 66 kind of got them off the hook for dealing with cultural history. And I think they're back on that hook now. I think, they've treated this in terms of natural resource management, telling the story of natural history of the landscape place. It's such an obvious missed opportunity in terms of what people are going to be coming to the Badlands for with the opening of the presidential library, that anything that gives them an opportunity now to engage in, maybe they don't have the right personnel and staff in uh, Medora to do this. Maybe it needs to emanate from the National Park Service themselves. But there's an opportunity for them here to tell the story of cultural history of the MHA Nation, the Lakota people, the frontier ranchers, and the impact that park that property played in the formative experience of Teddy Roosevelt and his conservation ethic. And they keep, returning the comment that, well, we're not in that business anymore. And I think there's no option for them but to get back into that business, because it's such a rich opportunity, and I keep trying to characterize this in my communications to the Park Service, an opportunity there for them to come out looking like heroes instead of looking like villains, to reap the public appreciation for their understanding of the merits of being responsive to people that, quite frankly, know more about this issue than they do. I mean, the greatest longevity of anybody working in the park right now is about 20 years, I think. And this experience that goes deep in the roots of people that have occupied those landscapes for not just decades but for generations and centuries, that behooves them to get in there and treat that with respect and courtesy, and make it a central feature of their presentation of the park. So um, I will send you another copy of the significance statement in my bibliography, so that if there are people that, aren't willing to wait for me to remember to send it to them by contacting me, that they can go and find it on your website. I'll also be sharing it with Patrick Springer, and I've already placed it on record with the State Historic Preservation Office. So I've had my say. uh how's that saying goes? Say what you have to say and then say goodbye. I think this is my goodbye. I welcome feedback from anybody along the way. I found my conversation 2 days ago with Bill Peterson especially gratifying. In fact, it was early yesterday morning. He's one of those people that realize the best time of day to actually get my clearest thinking is about 7:30 in the morning. So as soon as he got to work yesterday morning, he called me and said, do you have the information that you need to explain this 106 process to people who are interested? And I thanked him for that. He shared with me that he has grown in his understanding of the importance of these horses as both a historic resource and a feature of cultural heritage. He said that in his first encounter, when he came here 3.5 years ago, and I was serving on the state historical board at that time, and we had several conversations, I would always kind of say, this is something that's coming into focus now. And I would, yeah, maybe, I don't know, I wouldn't say I saw his eyes glaze over, but it wasn't as important to him as it was to me at that point in time when he first came here. And he says, as he continues to learn about this and learn the dimensions of it, and I admire that in a public official, somebody that can be influenced and can become better informed, because personally, that's how I become better informed about these things. That's why I feel so secure in saying what I'm telling people today, is that I have learned in the process of discovery about this. And um, discovering why there's validity to this basis. It's not my feeling, it's not my whim. It's informed by my feelings. It's informed by the evocative spiritual aspects of what you share in your encounters with the horses out there. And it's, all that heritage that goes back to watching those school kids seeing the Indian spotted ponies coming onto the playground 55 years ago. It all stems from the emotional impact, but it also has a sound basis, I think, in public policy and in the law. And at some point in time, it may come down to addressing it from those perspectives as well. So, there. I'm done. I
Well, thank you. I wanted to touch on something that you just said. So one, I think that we've tried to make people aware of this, but as this process continues with the State Historic Preservation Office, the public can weigh in, and they are looking at those at the public comments that are coming into the State Historic Preservation Office. And I
Yes,
also think in general, there's a lot of advocates that always think that um, our legislators or our lawmakers or the decision makers just know should just be aware of every aspect and every angle of a story. And I think what you just said about the Historic Preservation Office and how much he has learned through this process about the significance of these courses is important, because had all of us not been sending in our comments to his office and help to educate him on different angles and different aspects of this, I mean, I think it just also just reiterates we need to speak up. And like you said, get your voice in there, because you never know when you're going to say something that might be that little piece that a legislator or a decision maker needs to make a more educated decision. Does that make sense?
very much so, and I think that's exactly right. And you've been nice enough to remind us about sending some of our uh, information both to the director of the National Park Service and to various people along the way, people who have been both supportive of our mission and people that maybe we would consider as unreceptive, but to send to courteously send those opinions along to those folks. And I've been a little negligent in some of my follow-up letters because I've been kind of focused in on this particular on kind of solidifying my point of view and my opinion as we go. But uh, yeah, let's see, what did you remind me of there? Oh, I always try to give consideration to the fact that we place trust in our public officials, and I place trust in Bill Peterson. I have about a 3.5 year working relationship with him now, but I've known a lot of people at the State Historical Society longer than I've known him. And we have to put our trust in those people to make a fair judgment and to follow the process and procedures. And so I don't think we're asking anything special of them. I don't think we're asking favors. We're just asking them to please consider all of this information that has come to our attention, and then you know draw the right conclusion on the basis of that. So I don't ever feel like I'm lobbying him for a particular outcome. I'm simply presenting him with irrefutable evidence.
Right.
uh,
And that's something too that we had talked about in another talk. Josh Boucher had said in a horse talk with us that part of what he was trying to do when the resolution process started with our state was give advocates an organized way to um, to channel and funnel the information they were trying to get to legislators. And the biggest way for that was through the public testimony that they have for the resolution that we did. And it's the same kind of a thing here too. And I think it just reiterates again how important it is for the public to speak up if something is important to you. There are opportunities, and being quiet isn't going to get things done. Um, your voice needs to be heard, and the more that they're hearing voices from people, the more that it's going to impact the outcome. Um, I do want to ask you, so does this Section 106 review process, um, does it only relate to the National Park Service, or is it all levels of government? So does this apply to the BLM? Does it apply to the Forest Service?
yes, it does.
Okay,
Yes, all federal agencies.
okay. So this is something that other advocates could look at too, as part of a process, and really connecting with their state historic preservation offices, because they exist in every state, correct?
Yeah, and yes, they do, and it's it's a mixed bag in terms of the extent of authority that the state historic preservation officer has. I can think about sort of two extremes. One of the first classic examples of an appeal of the process was the preservation of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Pennsylvania Central Railroad in New York City, and it was slated for demolition or incorporation as a sort of a scenic background for a modernist building in the early 1960s. Very, really about the time the Historic Preservation Act was uh, enacted. It was signed into law, and it was a citizens group kind of headed up by Jacqueline Kennedy and a number of very influential New Yorkers that, uh, you know, they said we're gonna test the limits of this process, and it was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and their directive, it was the classic answer that was given back by the then Justice of the Supreme Court, Brennan, was how did the railroad come to own this property? Did they steal it fair and square? And that's why I think ownership is an important part of this that sometimes gets overlooked. There was I think a sad outcome. I'm not sure that the outcome is set, but there was a citizens group that had argued very persuasively for the preservation of the BNSF railroad across the Missouri River, and again, it was a question of ownership. Did the railroad own that bridge, or because it was on state property, did the state own it? And it comes down to the willingness of the state agency to argue on behalf of this, that yes, we do have an ownership interest in this. We can require policies, but we also we do it because we have an ownership interest. So I mentioned that I've seen both successes and failures in the outcomes of this 106 process, and I
And I
always
was actually just talking to Pat Springer about that yesterday, and he said, "Be glad that you weren't fighting the BNSF Railroad because of the bridge situation." And that's a situation where here in North Dakota, there was a bridge that, like you said, many people believe is historical, should be left alone, and they didn't get the support of the State Historic Preservation Office or our legislators to keep it in place the way that we have with the horses. So
well, I might just shade that just slightly differently. It was the citizens group had done absolutely everything that could have been asked of them. I would say that they did get the support of the State Historic Preservation Office. The limit of the State Historic Preservation Officer's authority was to say, we disagree with your conclusion that it's going to be demolished. And they have the opportunity then to proceed without without the concurrence, and
right.
it and in his role as the State Historic Preservation Office, Bill Peterson brought the issue to the State Historical Board, which also has authority uh, within state law to concur in those findings, in his findings, and we likewise were on record as I served on the historical board with disagreeing that there would be no negative impact from the demolition of the bridge. So I think uh, that authority was pushed as far as it could be pushed there, and it ultimately came down to a matter that was decided by the state Supreme Court and the state Attorney General's office, that the state wasn't going to fight to prove that they had an ownership interest in the bridge, and that probably was the end of the matter. So
Well, thank you for clarifying that. It was something that came up yesterday in a conversation I had. So, yeah, we're glad that we weren't fighting the railroad, but this doesn't, but that also reiterates too that no matter what the State Historic Preservation Office does find, it's just one piece of this puzzle that we're putting together to try to win to keep these horses there. But it's a very important piece and something I think that's overlooked.
great. That's
Does anybody else have any questions for Steve? I appreciate your time. I always appreciate talking to you. I appreciate your emails, and I appreciate, like I said, a lot of times I'll be having a horrible day or a horrible week, and Steve always seems to send the perfect email at the perfect time, saying just the right things or giving me a little nugget of information that I didn't know. So I do appreciate it. The purpose of these always are to educate our followers, because I believe that educated advocates is really what we need to move forward with any kind of advocacy. So knowing who and when and what to talk to and the different pieces that are at play. So there's always a lot going on with the wild horses of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We're all sitting and waiting for a decision, but in the background, there's a lot of things that we're working on that we'll share as we can to just make sure that these horses stay exactly where they are. So we hope that this was helpful. And Steve, again, I can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge with everybody, and I appreciate it.
I really thank those of you who have stuck with us through at least part of this session today, or anybody that may read it later. Thank you for your time and attention and concern and everything that everyone is doing to try to uh, accomplish a very meaningful goal.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone be well.
Thank you.